Well, we got, I guess it's 2 o'clock, so we can start right in. I'd like to thank everybody who's joining us online. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we will try to address them at the end of the session if there's anything that comes up. And I'd like to introduce everybody. I'm Joanne Hamburg with the Real Estate Exchange, and I'm pleased today to have attorney David Rochford Jr. joining me. And our topic today is cybersecurity with real estate. So I'd like to introduce attorney David Rochford and have him tell us a little bit about himself and his company.
Hi, Joanne. Thanks for having me today. Appreciate it.
Appreciate
I'm a real estate attorney and my office is in Leominster. I've been practicing real estate law for 25 years, and it's a specialty. I don't practice any other type of law, just real estate law. So we've had a lot of transactions in these 25 years. My office consists of a total of 5 attorneys and support staff, and we do real estate closings throughout Massachusetts and Southern New Hampshire. We represent buyers, sellers, and mortgage lenders, primarily mortgage lenders. We represent a lot of local mortgage lenders in the lending process, and a lot of national lenders as well who are lending locally. But I've been in it for quite a while, and my staff, I think all together, we probably have over 100 years of experience between us. But
That's awesome. I know I've worked with you for years, so I guess it's 25 years I've been working with you because we've done a lot of transactions together.
Yeah, from the start.
Yeah, so it's awesome. But so some of the things I don't know a lot about cybersecurity, so I'm really glad that you're willing to take the time to educate me and some of our followers. So can you tell me, like, what are the biggest threats or most common facing a real estate transaction today?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not a trained cybersecurity person, but I can tell you in the industry, I've learned an awful lot about it, and having a small business, having to be on top of the threats that are out there and the threats that we've experienced. So I can certainly address that. But I think the biggest thing that we face as far as cybersecurity goes, type of threats in real estate, is that of wire fraud. So there are bad actors out there, cyber criminals, whatever you want to call them, that are constantly looking for ways to scam real estate agents, brokers, buyers, sellers, and real estate attorneys, because they know that there's large dollar transactions that transpire in real estate. So for them, the target makes sense. They spend a lot of time on transactions, and it's a numbers game for them. So they'll attack, in a day, they'll send out 40 to 50 emails trying to track different transactions that are going on, or even more. Some of the big outfits will send out thousands of emails just trying to find a niche in the armor somewhere. And once they find that, they don't have to get into a specific transaction, but if they can break into an email email account for a real estate attorney's office or a realtor's office, or even an individual buyer or seller, if they get into that account, they can start watching it and seeing what's going on and find a specific transaction that they want to jump in on. And when they do, they start targeting other professionals that are involved in the transaction by sending them emails. And it ultimately ends up with you receiving a bogus email from them that says, open this document. It has to do with a real estate transaction. And usually if you take a look at the email, you can tell it's fraudulent, or it doesn't have anything to do with a particular transaction you're involved in, but it may at the same time. What they're looking to do is capture your credentials so they can sign into your email account. And what they do is they sign into the email account and they just lay dormant, watching emails come and go. And then when they find the right one, they jump in at it. And what they try to do is switch out wire instructions, or tell a seller or buyer who's not particularly experienced in the transaction to send wires to a different location, or they switch out wire information unknowingly and send that information to the closing attorney. And the attorney, if they're not diligent about it, may end up sending the wire, which is seller proceeds or earnest money deposits, commissions. They may send them to the fraudster, and then once it's wired, it's very difficult to get that money back.
Wow, that's crazy. What kind of things would you suggest to help a real estate agent or a buyer or seller that's in the process of purchasing a home to stop these phishing scams or
Well,
to protect themselves?
yeah, the biggest thing that we've implemented is education and just educating our staff and our buyer and seller clients that they need to look out for these things. And what they're looking for is anytime they're getting unsolicited emails on transactions or emails for transactions they don't recognize or emails from people they don't recognize, or sometimes people they do recognize, but the email addresses don't match up. So it could be somebody in the transaction that says um, John Smith, and we know a John Smith. So we might be apt to open that email. But if you look closer, it really didn't come from John Smith. And then if John Smith is using a lot of time, it would be broken English or vernacular that doesn't fit to the transaction. A lot of times you can find errors in the email and identify it as fraudulent, and that
I've had,
helps.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I've
Yeah,
had stuff from like Amazon. I mean, nothing to do with real estate, but I
yeah,
mean, it's just amazing how much fraud is out there and
exactly.
how people are trying to
Yeah, and
scam
it's the same type of thing when you get an email from PayPal. I see this one all the time.
it.
It says, "Hey, your order for $500 worth of equipment is being processed," and then it says, "If you didn't order this, call us." And you kind of panic if you're not familiar with it, and it's $500, so you got to follow up on it, and you make the phone call, and then they've got you, and they're experts at manipulating you and in telling you. I've gotten phone calls before like that, unrelated to real estate, but personal, but in at the office, and they'll call and say, if this is the IRS or whatever the case may be, and the sheriff's going to come over and arrest you if you don't send us, gift cards from wherever.
Yeah.
So obviously, people see that regularly. It's what they don't see is the real estate side. So people are familiar with Amazon scams and PayPal scams and such, but then they go to buy or sell a home, and they think maybe they're a little bit more insulated or protected from that type of fraud in that type of transaction, but really they're not. It's a huge industry. I was reading $2.4 billion a year that cyber criminals steal from transactions, and something
Wow,
like
that's
one in every 150 transactions is subject to either an attempt or a successful attempt um, of getting uh, ripped off. So
yeah,
stealing
it's just insane the steps that someone will go through to try to get money from someone who
And I
doesn't.
can I can tell you a story of one of the paralegals experienced is we had a seller client that we are working with on a transaction, and what happened is somewhere along the line a fraudster got into the transaction, and they sent my paralegal wire instructions for the seller's proceeds. So the seller was getting $250,000 for the sale of their property. And the seller emailed the paralegal and said, "Hey, instead of taking a check, I know in the email before I told you I wanted a check, but I actually want it wired to me now. So here's my wire instructions. Please have the closing attorney wire the funds to me." And the paralegal was thinking like, okay, you can do that. And then she thought a little bit more about it, and she and I talked, and come to find out, it was kind of odd that we knew the seller was moving to Michigan, but the bank was in California,
Mm.
and we couldn't quite figure it out. It wasn't a big name bank or anything, and we went back and forth. And then so I told the paralegal to tell the person that we would wire the money, and we would make sure the money got wired to them, full knowing that we weren't going to. We knew at this point that it was a fraud. So we got the seller's check and we FedExed the check to the seller where it was supposed to go to, that they didn't want to wire. But the fraudster actually called the paralegal and said, "I haven't received my wire. I don't know what's wrong with you. How come you won't send me my wire?" And it had the audacity to actually call and harass the paralegal because the paralegal didn't send the wire. So these people put a lot of time and effort into it, and they're
Wow,
big outfits. Sometimes there's 100 people in a room making these fraudulent calls and emails just to see if they can get somebody on the hook, and they do. If they weren't successful, they wouldn't do it.
when you mentioned like educating and learning, like what kind of steps? I know like my tech guy, he always wants me to have like two-factor authentication,
Yeah,
and I hate it.
Yeah.
But
But honestly, that's the biggest thing you can do is get multi-factor authentication, and the type that it, re, it realizes that if you're not in the office and you log on to your email, it's going to ask you to, it's going to send you a code over your phone or ask you to enter a code from your phone, and that's probably the best protection that you can get, other than realizing that you shouldn't be clicking on things that you're not aware of, because if you click somewhere and you enter in your email address and your password and you think you're logging on to Microsoft and you're really not, then they've got you. Of course, they have to get around the multi-factor authentication part if you have it. If you don't have it, then you're completely vulnerable. But if you do have it, there are ways to get the fraudsters can get around it. I don't know how they get around it, but they do. So that's part of it. And I know when we send wires, when we communicate with our bank, we have multi-factor authentication, and we have a process when we send a wire, we have it verified from internally. So let's just say, for example, I'll set up the wire to go out. Somebody else from the office has to release it. So I can't send it and release it. I can only send it, and somebody else from the office has to release it. And all that entails multi-factor authentication as well from the bank. So it's a big process to send a wire, but it didn't used to be until fraudsters caught onto it and said, "Hey, this is where we can get people," and they do.
I've had a few attorneys that we've worked with that don't even want to do wires anymore.
Yeah, that happens, and then in probably offices that don't do a lot of transactions can have the luxury of saying that. We do a large volume, and it's difficult for us to say, "Oh, we're not going to wire here, or we're not going to wire there, or we don't do wires." It is very convenient, and people expect it. And if you have a transaction that's back to back, or the people need the funds right away, then wire is almost the only the best way to go.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. What about like securing your email? I mean, what would you recommend for that to make sure like email transactions? I know you talked about, somebody trying to hack into your email, and are there any recommendations for
Yeah,
email
so obviously,
communication?
strong passwords, and changing your passwords often. But the biggest thing is the multi-factor authentication, because that really, even if you have a weak password, someone's not going to be able to get into it unless they're an experienced hacker. If you have multi-factor authentication, and just using common sense when clicking on things, more often than not, hackers aren't trying to force their way into your email. They pull it from you strategically. They'll send you an email saying, "Here's a PDF file you need to open," and it looks legitimate. So you go and click on it, and it says, "Oh, you need to log on to Microsoft." So you go, "Okay, well, I'll enter my Microsoft information," and they don't even brute force into the email. They just get it from you because you type it in, and then they have it, and you don't realize that you've actually compromised your account, and then
I
they
was
get in there.
I was thinking two-step authentication being like for banking accounts or stuff like that. I never think of it for
Yeah,
email.
no, we have it for our email as well. So if uh, it's not on every email we send, but when we get into when we log in the morning and turn the computer on, if the computer's been off for a while, or if they're working from home and going back and forth and switching locations, the email that we use will prompt the two-factor authentication to sign in. And then that brings us to encrypted emails. So sending sensitive banking information should be done encrypted anyways. But if you are sending wire information or receiving wire information, we always insist that it be encrypted, because that helps with the interception and switching of good information with bogus information. That's how it's done.
That's awesome that your company has set all those things up. I mean, it's just to protect everybody, which is great. I know I've heard of so many different things, like people writing fake checks, pretending they own a piece of property that they don't even own. I mean, it's amazing what these people can think of to try to scam somebody. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm sure you've seen these things.
Yeah, it's like you see all different kinds, and you wonder, gee, I never really thought of that, but these people, criminals, have criminal minds, and quite frankly, they're brilliant, and they take the time, and rather than go get a legitimate 9 to 5 job, they spend their time researching ways to rip people off, and then building organizations that do that. Some of the organizations that do this have hundreds of people that are just out there. It's a numbers game for them, and they just start pinging and sending emails and making phone calls, just waiting for one person to hit. So if they rip one person off, they've made 500 attempts on 500 other people in a day, and that doesn't matter to them because it's all numbers. They just got to find one person that they can get through on. And we've had, it goes beyond cyber as well, like you mentioned with checks. I've had a situation where I've had a real estate agent call me who has a listing, and they say, well, we have a Chinese nationalist that wants to buy a piece of land in Massachusetts that I have listed. He sent me an email, and he's looking for an attorney to hold the deposit. So right away, red flags go up because it's an international transaction, sight unseen, it's cash purchase. So all those red flags start going up, and I've seen it before. But I usually play along as far as I can, just to make sure that maybe it is legitimate. But in this one particular transaction, I got an email from the potential buyer who said, I'm going to buy the property sight unseen. I'm familiar with Massachusetts, and I'm going to be attending school up there, and I'm going to buy vacant land and build a house on it. And I need you to hold my deposit check. My deposit check's $75,000, and it was a high deposit, but they wanted me to hold it. And again, red flags continue to go up, but I followed up and said, yeah, send me the check, and we'll deposit it, and we'll move forward and do the legal side of it, the title examination, and get you ready for closing. And then sure enough, the check shows up, and it's drawn on a Canadian bank. Canadian banks are known for lax banking systems, so they take longer to process transactions than the United States does. So if I were to take that check and deposit it, it takes 10 or 15 days for it to clear. It clears the U.S. banking system pretty quickly, but it doesn't clear the Canadian system very quickly. And the fraudsters know that. So I received a check for $75,000, and there's no way to verify it or follow up on it. So I told the buyer that I deposited the check when I hadn't deposited it because I knew at this point it was fraudulent, just too many red flags. And sure enough, about 7 days later, the buyer emailed me back and said, I decided not to go through with the transaction. Will you please wire my money back to me? And of course, at that time, I just stopped communication with them because they wanted me to wire the money back. And once I wire the money's gone from my account, and then the check bounces 10 or 15 days later, and my office is without the 75,000, and that's just a typical example of how these work. And it just doesn't happen just to attorneys, but it happens to real estate brokers as well. Again, because they know this high value transactions.
Yeah, I mean, in this market since COVID, I mean, we have a lot more cash buyers. We have a lot of people. I mean, I've had people from California, Washington purchase homes sight unseen, that I've created a relationship with, and we're doing, FaceTime lives and looking at homes. And
sure.
So, you try to always think positive, that it's a good thing, but
right. But you got to be on your guard. Yeah,
it's just a shame.
The virtual side of it, like you mentioned, since COVID, the virtual transactions are commonplace. You have buyers from out of state, sellers from out of state, and it's common and ripe for fraud. And so you have to be careful.
Yeah. What should you do if you find you're in that situation? Like, all right, this is definitely fraud. This person is fake. They don't really want to buy this house. They're just stringing me along. Like, what should I do if I do come across
the biggest thing is really have some common sense when you're, and don't let your emotions get a hold of you. Because in transactions I've had a seller say, gee, I found a buyer, this buyer's reached out to me, and I'll say, it's not legitimate. It's just too many red flags. And the seller's like, oh, how do you know that? You don't know for sure. It's like, yeah, I know. Or you have a real estate agent saying, well, it sounds fraudulent, but geez, the property's been on the market. We really got to try this buyer. So, the emotions get the best of them. So, I think the biggest thing is use common sense. And then when you find, if you've gone too far in a transaction and you've been actually uh, taken a loss, then you obviously need to report it to the local and local police and authorities, and obviously a bank as well. I mean, there are processes. If you call your bank, they'll know how to put you in touch with people that they can in their fraud prevention or fraud recovery units, and local and state agencies will help you as well. But when I've received bogus checks in the past, like I mentioned, the $75,000 check, it's not the first one I've received. I've received several over the past 10 years. And the first couple that I received, I called the local police, and I had actually even reached out to an FBI office, and they were like, just tear the check up. If you know it's a fraud, just tear it up. We can't do anything about it. It's not like we have the time or energy or resources to chase it down and figure out what's going on. And it's true, because they probably get 100 phone calls a day just for people with bogus checks. So it's, they wouldn't even join me in maybe setting up a sting to catch this person or something. They weren't interested. However, if you call them and say, no, I screwed up and I'm out $75,000 or whatever the case may be, they do take action then and try to help you recover. But
That's good. I mean, you always hear like older folks, I mean, but it could be anybody. It doesn't matter, that
yeah,
have been taken with stories, which is really sad.
well, the scary thing that a lot of people don't think about these days is the advance of AI or artificial intelligence and being able to spoof people's voices and such. So you can have a seller that you're familiar with call you, and it sounds like the seller, or gee, I just got off the phone with Joanne, the real estate agent, and it sound like her, and she wants me to send the check here or wire the money here. And
Well, make sure they have my right account number. We just got
right.
to make sure they're
Well,
sending it to the
it's the
right
voice. I
place.
gotta, if I hear that voice, I'll know it's you. So
Yeah.
yeah, but if it's
No,
actually AI, who knows, right?
it's scary. I mean, I'm doing a whole course on AI, artificial intelligence, just trying, to learn so that we can be more efficient for our
Mhm.
clients. But it is scary. I don't know where it's going to go with it, but it's amazing what technology can do. I mean, look, I mean, just Zoom. I mean, yeah, I never had been on Zoom before COVID.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
and like you said, there's so much technology, and I wouldn't be surprised that, there's AI and risk and frauds and things will be coming up more and more as we go along.
Right. And you mentioned again about what to do when you find yourself in a situation. I mentioned, getting your emotions in check, and don't be afraid to follow up with the fraudster and call them out. If it's a legitimate buyer, they have to understand, or if it's a legitimate seller, they have to understand that you're just doing your due diligence. Maybe they're a little bit offended that you think that they're a fraudster when they're really not. But if you follow up with them and say, can you send me a proof of this or proof of that? They might be a little offended, but it's in their best interest.
Well, it's in everybody's. I mean,
Yeah.
just, is there anything that, stands out to you that would be like, you should have like a checklist of things, or I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it, but, that might
Well,
bring up some red flags?
it's good to set specific processes and procedures and have an understanding with yourself, things you will and will not do, and stick to those, and rarely make an exception. Like in the office, as I mentioned, we have a process where if you send a wire, you can't release it. Um, would we make an exception to that? Maybe, but it's when you start making exceptions and doing things out of the norm is when the mistakes happen, or you fall prey to fraudsters. So just having things that when I get a check, I'm always going to make sure that I verify this, that, or the other thing, or reach out to the buyer and confirm this, and keep consistent with what you do, and
Would,
keep your on your
would it
toes.
make, would it make sense to call the actual lending institute that wrote the check? So I mean, if they're sending a check from a bank in Canada, would it be worth
Mhm.
calling the bank in Canada and saying, hey, I just received this check for 75,000. Is
Yeah,
this legitimate?
if you can reach somebody at the institution, and there's been times when I had followed up on checks, and more than once, the checks that I received were drawn on TD Bank, which is a Canadian bank, and it's hard to get through their system.
Huh.
And one time, just recently, oddly enough, we had a situation that I thought for sure was fraudulent, and one of the other attorneys in my office, it was their client, and it fit the bill perfectly. They were buying a piece of property cash. They were from out of state. They were sending a check drawn on TD Bank from Canada, and we were like, no, this is definitely fraud. And we called the person out on it. We said, this seems fraudulent. And they said, no, no, here's my contact person at the branch in Canada. So I actually got on the phone, called the person in Canada. They didn't return my call, but I got into the TD banking system. I thought it was their system. It sounded like it, sound legitimate, dial your person's extension. So I dialed their extension. I got their voicemail. The person never did return my call, but we ended up going back and forth, and it was a legitimate transaction that we did end up, in the end, we verified that it was a valid check drawn on TD Bank. So, and the person was paying cash for land.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could just make them wait until the check has
Yeah,
cleared your account.
and that's what we did end up doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we said because of that, we could, and it was a fast close. She wanted to close right away. And we said, we have to wait at least 20 days before we close, unless you can wire the funds to us. And she was like, no, we can't wire it. We have to have a check. So, but it was a legitimate transaction. So, but then afterwards, the other attorney in the office and I thought about it, and it's like, yeah, we didn't do anything wrong. We were very diligent about it, and it was for her protection and for our protection.
Well, and the client that even wrote the check should be thrilled, because if it was the other way around, they know that you're looking out for their best interest still.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the buyers would come
In the
back.
end, as frustrated as the buyer was, she did understand in the end, but she did get pretty upset when we challenged her on a lot of things. But that's what you have to do, to get it, make sure you're not losing your client's money or your own money.
It's just amazing that it's all come to this, but and I think it's great. I mean, there's been a lot of wonderful information. I don't know if anyone on the participating has any questions. I think you've answered all my questions I could think of. Like I said, I don't know a ton about cyber, security or cyber threats. Unfortunately, I've experienced some things in real estate that weren't just cyber. They're more like fraudulent checks or people saying they own a piece of property they don't really own, which is always interesting because, we want to get the listing and they call and they're like, oh yeah, I own this property and I want to sell it. And you do the research and it's like, but it's not in your name.
Yeah,
it's my sister's,
right.
And it's
and you do your due diligence as much as you can, and then in the end you find out it's a legitimate transaction. So on the next one, you kind of second guessing yourself, but you do just have to be that diligent and just.
We had a gentleman that had a piece of land that he wanted to sell. Said he lived in another state and he wanted to sell it because he's not coming back. So we started the whole process, listed the house, the land, put it up for sale, put up a sign, and the neighbor calls and says, that's my land. And like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you never know, even with doing your homework,
Yeah, you hear about it all the time, and you see articles about vacant land theft and fraud. You think that must be happening elsewhere, but it does. It happens. It
right
happens
here.
locally. Yeah.
No, it's crazy. Well, I really appreciate your time. I think it's been a great topic. I've learned a lot, and thank you very much for spending time with us. And
yeah, no problem.
I look
Anytime.
forward to working with you more and your
Yes.
team. Love them all.
Great, and it was good to see you. So
you too. But thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you,
you.
everybody, for joining, and have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.